I stood in the massive foyer of my Atlanta estate, staring blindly at the grand crystal chandelier hanging above the sweeping mahogany staircase. The house was far too quiet. For 6 agonizing months, the silence had been deafening. I still half expected to hear the booming, joyful laugh of Marcus Vance echoing through the halls, followed by the heavy thud of his boots. But my adoptive father was gone. He had succumbed to a sudden heart attack, leaving behind an empty, sprawling mansion and a towering $50 million commercial real estate empire for me to run entirely alone. The exhaustion was settling deep into my bones, a physical weight that made my limbs feel like lead. Running Vance Enterprises was a grueling, relentless battle. The board of directors was already circling like vultures, waiting for the grieving young daughter to make a single misstep so they could tear everything apart. I had barely slept in weeks, surviving on black coffee and sheer willpower. All I wanted this afternoon was to close my eyes, retreat into the dark, quiet sanctuary of my home, and pretend the heavy crown of CEO didn't belong to me for just a few hours. Then the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the foyer. The sound was sharp, heavy, and demanding. I frowned, tightening the belt of my silk robe around my waist. I wasn't expecting any deliveries today, and my private security team at the front gate always radioed ahead before letting anyone up the long, winding, tree-lined driveway. Assuming it was just a courier with the final agonizing probate documents for the estate that required my immediate signature, I walked over and pulled the heavy oak doors open. The humid Georgia heat rushed inside instantly, but a sudden violent chill spiked straight down my spine. I stopped breathing. My hand froze completely on the brass handle. My heart slammed against my ribs with terrifying bruising force. Standing on my front porch, framed by the white pillars of my home, were the 2 people I had spent a lifetime trying to erase from my memory. Eleanor and Richard, my biological parents. Time seemed to fracture and shatter into a million jagged pieces. I was no longer the 32-year-old corporate CEO holding the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire. I was instantly reduced to a terrified, trembling 7-year-old girl standing on a cracked curb in scuffed sneakers, wondering why she wasn't good enough. Eleanor stepped forward first. She looked remarkably well preserved. Her dark hair was perfectly coiffed, her designer wrap dress was impeccable, and her expensive jewelry caught the afternoon light. But her eyes held that exact same cold, calculating emptiness I remembered from my childhood. She pressed a manicured hand to her chest, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. She let out a dramatic, trembling gasp that sounded so painfully rehearsed it belonged on a soap opera set. "Maya," she whispered, her voice cracking with a fragile, manufactured emotion. "My beautiful, perfect little girl. We finally found you." She reached out her arms, opening wide as if to pull me into a desperate motherly embrace. I took a sharp, desperate step back into the foyer. The movement was involuntary, a pure, visceral survival instinct kicking in. The heavy silence of the house pressed against my ears, making the blood roar in my head. "Don't touch me," I said. My voice was dangerously low, but it echoed off the marble floors behind me, sharp and absolute. Her theatrical, hurt expression sent a violent shudder through my chest. The carefully constructed walls in my mind, the mental barriers I had spent decades building through intensive therapy and sheer willpower, began to crack and splinter. Suddenly, the scent of expensive floral perfume on my porch faded entirely. It was abruptly replaced by the stinging, sterile scent of industrial bleach and cheap floor wax. I was 7 years old again. I remembered the freezing air conditioning in the back of Richard's luxury sedan. The dark leather seats had been stiff cold and uncomfortable against my bare legs. I had worn my favorite yellow sundress that day, the one with the little white daisies embroidered on the pockets. I had been so excited, genuinely believing we were going out for a special family trip to get ice cream. My older biological brother Marcus Jr. sat beside me. He was the golden child, the prized son, who could do no wrong. He played with a handheld video game, the bright screen illuminating his face, completely ignoring me. He didn't even bother to look up when the car pulled into the gravel parking lot of a grim brick building with heavy iron bars over the windows. I remembered the intake worker at the orphanage. She was a woman with kind but incredibly tired eyes, wearing a faded blue cardigan. She had offered me a broken red crayon and a coloring book with half the pages missing, trying to keep me distracted while my parents stood at the high wooden front desk. But I hadn't colored. I had clutched that broken red crayon in my tiny fist and listened to every word. "We can't take her with us," Richard had told the woman. His tone was brisk and entirely casual, as if he were returning a defective appliance to a department store. "We only need the boy to carry on the family name. 2 children are a financial burden we simply aren't willing to carry right now, and a girl won't provide any return on our investment." The intake worker had looked absolutely appalled. Her pen hovered over the thick stack of surrender forms. "You're surrendering your daughter just like that because of her gender. It's a matter of legacy and practical economics," Eleanor had chimed in, adjusting her pearl earring with a look of mild boredom. "She's simply not a fit for our family's future. I'm sure you'll find someone else to take her off your hands." I remembered the red crayon slipping from my trembling fingers, hitting the linoleum floor with a hollow click. I remembered running to the heavy glass doors, pressing my small, frantic hands against the cold pane. I watched them walk casually back to the car. I watched Richard open the door for Marcus Jr., ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. I screamed until my throat bled. I begged them to come back, pleading with them not to leave me in that cold, bleach-scented place. The intake worker had to wrap her arms around my waist, holding me back as their taillights disappeared down the dusty road, taking my brother and my entire world with them. They had left me completely and utterly shattered, discarded like trash because I wasn't born a boy. A warm, humid Georgia breeze rustled the massive magnolia trees in my front yard, snapping me back to the present moment. My heart was hammering against my ribs, wild and frantic. I dug my fingernails deep into my palms until the sharp, grounding pain cleared my mind. I forced myself to stand taller, blocking the doorway. I was not that helpless, unwanted little girl anymore. I was a woman who had fought tooth and nail for every single thing I possessed. I had been raised by Marcus Vance, a man who taught me resilience, business acumen, and the true meaning of unconditional love. I carried his immense strength within me, and I would not let these ghosts tear me down. I looked at Eleanor standing on my grand porch, with her fake tears glistening in the afternoon sun. Beside her, Richard stood with his hands casually resting in the pockets of his expensive slacks. He offered a tight, polite smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "Maya, please," Eleanor whimpered, dabbing the corner of her eye with a pristine white tissue. "You have absolutely no idea the agony we've been through all these years. The sleepless nights, the endless tears. We've spent years desperately searching for you. Every single day I prayed to find my sweet daughter so we could finally reconnect our family." The sheer audacity of the lie made my blood run ice cold. It was a physical revulsion that twisted my stomach into hard knots. "You didn't search for me," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm, though a violent storm raged beneath the surface. "I spent my entire childhood bouncing around the broken foster system, feeling like nobody wanted me, until Marcus Vance finally took me in. If you had genuinely wanted to find me, you knew exactly which brick building you dumped me in 25 years ago." Richard stepped forward smoothly, adopting a soothing, fatherly tone that made my skin crawl. "Now, Maya, let's not dwell on the painful past. We were young and foolish. We made incredibly difficult decisions under immense financial pressure. But we are here now. We want to make amends. We want to be a real family again." He shifted his weight, and as he did, his elbow bumped the thick, heavy leather briefcase hanging from his shoulder. The brass clasp was partially undone. My eyes drifted downward. A thick stack of crisp white legal documents poked out from the top compartment. I recognized the heavy legal-sized envelopes. I recognized the blue binding tape characteristic of aggressive court filings. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with sickening, devastating clarity. They hadn't hired a private investigator out of a sudden surge of parental guilt. They hadn't spent decades wrestling with the profound heartbreak of a missing child. They hadn't come to my doorstep to make amends or seek forgiveness. They had come because of Forbes magazine. 3 weeks ago, the publication ran a massive, highly publicized feature on the passing of Marcus Vance. My adoptive father was a legend, a self-made titan in the Atlanta commercial real estate market. The article extensively detailed his incredible legacy, his brilliant business strategies, and the sprawling empire he had built from nothing. It also prominently featured a full-page photo of me. It named me as his sole heir and the new CEO of Vance Enterprises. It explicitly detailed the estimated $50 million value of his primary personal estate, completely separate from the corporate holdings. I looked from the thick legal files in the briefcase back up to Richard's face. The polite fatherly mask was still firmly in place, but I could see the raw, predatory greed pooling in the depths of his dark eyes. They smelled money. They smelled my adoptive father's money. "You read the article," I stated. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Eleanor blinked her theatrical tears, instantly vanishing as her posture stiffened. "What article, sweetheart? We have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." "The Forbes piece," I said, taking a deliberate step forward. The suffocating grief in my chest suddenly ignited into a fierce protective inferno of rage. My father died 6 months ago, the man who actually raised me, the man who paid for my education, who held my hand when I was sick, who taught me how to survive and thrive in this brutal world. He just died and you read about his net worth in a magazine. Richard's polite smile faltered. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. "Marcus Vance was your adoptive father, Maya. He was a generous man, certainly. But we are your blood. We are your biological family, and blood matters." "Blood is a biological accident." I fired back, my voice vibrating with decades of suppressed anger. "You explicitly and willingly surrendered your parental rights to me 25 years ago. You threw me away like garbage because I was a girl. You do not get to show up on my porch now and pretend to care just because the little girl you discarded turned out to be profitable." "We are your parents!" Eleanor shouted, her voice losing its fragile, victimized edge entirely. It turned sharp, shrill, and viciously brittle. "You owe us some respect. We brought you into this world, Maya. You left me in an orphanage so you could carry on a family name with a son you decided was better than me," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "I owe you absolutely nothing. Get off my property immediately before I call my security team and have you dragged off." I grabbed the brass handle, moving to slam the heavy oak door in their faces. I wanted to shut them out, to lock the deadbolt, and return to the quiet, dark sanctuary of my mourning. I wanted to call my corporate attorney and tell her to file a restraining order to ensure these vultures never came near my estate again. But Richard was faster. He thrust his polished dress shoe into the doorway, physically blocking the heavy wood from closing. The expensive leather scraped harshly against my pristine marble threshold. The polite, concerned, fatherly facade melted away completely, revealing the ugly truth underneath. The faux warmth in his eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute ruthlessness. This was the man who had traded his 7-year-old daughter away without a single second thought. This was the true face of the monster from my childhood nightmares. He unclasped his leather briefcase entirely and reached inside. He didn't pull out a cherished childhood photo. He didn't pull out a heartfelt handwritten letter of apology. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents I had spotted earlier. With a sudden aggressive motion, he shoved the heavy bundle of papers hard into my chest. I reflexively brought my hands up to catch them, the sharp paper edges of the manila envelope biting into my palms. "We aren't here for a tearful reunion, Maya," Richard announced, his voice echoing like cracking ice in the humid Atlanta air. "We're suing for 50% of Marcus Vance's $50 million estate, and as your biological parents, we are legally entitled to every single penny." The heavy stack of legal papers hit my chest with a dull thud. I didn't reach up to catch them. I let the thick manila envelope slide off my silk robe and hit the marble floor, the pages spilling out across the entryway like garbage. Richard's smug, fatherly expression faltered for a fraction of a second. "Get off my porch," I commanded. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. I used the exact same icy, authoritative tone my adoptive father used to evict deadbeat commercial tenants. I slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the deadbolt with a sharp, satisfying click. I backed away from the glass panels, my breathing shallow and fast. My hands were shaking so violently I had to press them against my thighs. I stared at the legal summons scattered across the floor, feeling the ghost of Marcus Vance standing right beside me in the quiet foyer. Marcus hadn't just given me his last name and a bank account. He had given me an armor of steel. I pictured his strong, weathered hands and his sharp, discerning eyes. When he brought me home from that sterile, bleach-scented orphanage, he didn't coddle me. He saw a terrified, discarded little girl who jumped at loud noises, and he decided to forge her into a weapon. "Tears don't negotiate, Maya," he told me when I was 12. He had dropped a complex commercial lease agreement on the kitchen table while the other neighborhood kids were outside playing. He smelled like expensive cologne-rolled blueprints and absolute ambition. He made me read every line of that contract until I understood it. "The world will try to take everything you have." His deep, rumbling voice echoed in my memory. "Especially because you are a black woman. You have to be twice as smart and 3 times as tough just to keep what is yours." He had spent 20 years teaching me the brutal, unforgiving realities of the real estate business. He raised me with strict, unwavering discipline, but also with a fierce, unconditional love I had never known. He left me as the sole CEO of Vance Enterprises 6 months ago, knowing exactly the kind of wolves I would eventually face. He knew my life was already a solitary, exhausting grind. Since his passing, I practically lived at the corporate office. My world consisted entirely of spreadsheets, property acquisitions, and fending off hostile takeover attempts from within my own ranks. The next morning, the glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of Vance Enterprises felt exactly like a shark tank. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table projecting next quarter's revenue forecasts onto the digital screen. "These projections are overly optimistic, Maya," Charles Montgomery drawled. He leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a gold pen against his notepad. Charles was the oldest member of the board, a relic of an old boys club who absolutely despised taking orders from me. "Your father built this empire on conservative, calculated risks." Charles continued, not bothering to hide his condescension. "You're pushing for aggressive expansion in a highly volatile market. It's reckless." "The market isn't volatile, Charles. It's shifting," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "And my father taught me to buy when everyone else is paralyzed by fear. The waterfront commercial lots will double in value by next year." "Assuming we have the liquidity to develop them," another board member muttered, exchanging a knowing glance with Charles. "We need steady leadership right now, not emotional gambles." They didn't respect me. They saw me as a grieving daughter playing dress-up in her father's boardroom. They scrutinized every contract I drafted and every property I acquired, waiting for me to show a single moment of weakness so they could vote me out. I held my ground, fighting them tooth and nail for 2 hours until the meeting finally adjourned. I retreated to my private office completely drained. The sprawling view of the Atlanta skyline usually calmed me, but today my stomach was tied in hard, painful knots. The heavy oak door clicked shut, and my best friend dropped a thick red file onto my desk. Sarah wasn't just my corporate attorney. She was the only anchor I had left in the world. We had been roommates in college, bonding over our shared obsession with corporate law and late-night coffee. She knew everything about my past, every nightmare about the orphanage, and exactly who Richard and Eleanor were. I dug into them, Sarah said, her voice grim. I pulled their financial records, property deeds, shell companies, everything. I sank into my leather chair, staring at the red folder, as if it were a venomous snake. Tell me. They are drowning Maya, Sarah said. She pulled out a page filled with highlighted numbers and slid it across the desk. They are deeply, hopelessly in debt. They have multiple underwater mortgages, maxed out credit lines, and missed vehicle payments. They aren't living the high life anymore. They are weeks away from total bankruptcy. I traced the edge of my desk, a cold realization settling over me. What about their golden son? What about Marcus Jr.? Sarah let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He's a walking financial disaster. He started 3 different tech companies in the last 5 years. All of them failed spectacularly. She dropped several printed photographs onto my desk. They were screenshots from Marcus Jr.'s social media accounts. He was posing next to leased sports cars, wearing designer suits and standing on the decks of rented yachts. He's living completely off your biological parents' dwindling credit, Sarah explained, her voice laced with absolute disgust. He's a failed, arrogant entrepreneur, pretending to be a titan of industry. They have been funding his luxurious lifestyle to keep up appearances, and the well has finally run dry. The puzzle pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. My biological parents didn't spend decades searching for me out of love or remorse. They didn't come to my porch to make amends. They didn't even view me as a human being. I was just a bank account. I was an emergency parachute to save their failing social status and fund their golden child's arrogant delusions. They filed the suit early this morning. Sarah continued, pacing back and forth in front of my desk. They are claiming biological entitlement to the estate. It's a massive legal reach. Marcus legally adopted you. His will is rock solid. They have absolutely no legal standing to contest it. Then why are they trying? I asked, frustration leaking into my voice. Richard isn't stupid. He wouldn't waste his last few dollars on a high-profile attorney if he didn't think he had a play. They want a settlement, Sarah concluded, stopping to look me directly in the eye. They want to cause enough bad press, enough of a headache with your hostile board of directors, that you'll just write them a check for $5 million to make them go away. I stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the sprawling city my adoptive father had helped build, the city he trusted me to protect. The suffocating grief that had been weighing down my chest since yesterday finally ignited into a roaring protective fire. I would not give them a single dime. I would fight them in court, I would humiliate them, and I would protect Marcus Vance's legacy with every breath in my body. Draft an aggressive response, I told Sarah without turning around. We are going to crush this. I want to counter-sue for harassment. I want them buried in legal fees so deep they can't breathe. I'm already on it, Sarah said, gathering the red folder. I'll file the paperwork before the courts close today. She hurried out of the office, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor. The office was blissfully quiet for exactly 3 minutes. I closed my eyes, calculating my next move. I needed to plan exactly how to assure Charles Montgomery and the rest of the board that this frivolous lawsuit wouldn't affect company operations. I was ready for a long, drawn-out legal battle. I was ready to fight. Suddenly, the heavy glass door to my office flew open, hitting the wall with a violent crash. Sarah rushed back in. Her face was completely drained of color. She looked terrified, her hands visibly trembling as she gripped her tablet. Sarah. I stepped away from the window, my heart giving a sharp, painful lurch at the sheer panic in her eyes. What's wrong? She swallowed hard, struggling to catch her breath. The Judge Maya. They didn't just file a standard lawsuit, they filed for an emergency injunction. An injunction. I stepped forward, the air in the room suddenly turning thin and unbreathable. On what grounds? They hired someone ruthless. Sarah gasped, her voice cracking. They found a loophole. The judge just signed the order. Maya, they've frozen everything. I stared at her, unable to process the words. What do you mean, everything? Your corporate accounts, your personal trusts, the entire estate. Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with absolute horror. It's all frozen, effective immediately. You have nothing. The silence in my sprawling Atlanta estate was a physical weight pressing against my chest until it was hard to breathe. It had been exactly 6 months since my adoptive father, Marcus Vance, passed away from a sudden heart attack. 6 months of walking through these massive empty halls, expecting to hear his booming laugh or the heavy thud of his boots on the hardwood. Instead, there was only the suffocating quiet, paired with the relentless grinding pressure of running his $50 million real estate empire entirely alone. I tightened the belt of my silk robe, staring blankly at the grand crystal chandelier hanging above the sweeping mahogany staircase. I was exhausted. The board of directors was already circling like vultures at the corporate office, waiting for the grieving young daughter to make a single misstep so they could tear everything apart. I had barely slept in weeks, surviving on black coffee and sheer willpower. All I wanted this afternoon was to retreat into the dark sanctuary of my bedroom and pretend the heavy crown of CEO didn't belong to me for just a few hours. Then the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the foyer. The sound was sharp, heavy, and demanding. It cut through the silence like a gunshot. I frowned, glancing toward the front of the house. My private security team at the front gate usually radioed ahead before letting anyone up the long, winding, tree-lined driveway. Assuming it was just a courier with the final, agonizing probate documents for the estate that required my immediate signature, I walked over and pulled the heavy oak doors open. The humid Georgia heat washed over me instantly, but a violent chill spiked down my spine. I stopped breathing. My hand froze completely on the brass handle. My heart slammed against my ribs with terrifying bruising force. Standing on my front porch, framed by the white pillars of my home, were the two people I had spent a lifetime trying to erase from my memory: Eleanor and Richard, my biological parents. Time fractured into a million jagged pieces. I was no longer the 32-year-old corporate CEO holding the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire. I was instantly reduced to a terrified, trembling 7-year-old girl standing on a cracked curb in scuffed sneakers, wondering why she wasn't good enough. Eleanor stepped forward first. She looked remarkably well preserved. Her dark hair was perfectly coiffed. Her designer wrap dress was impeccable, and her expensive jewelry caught the afternoon light. But her eyes held that exact same cold, calculating emptiness I remembered from my childhood. She pressed a manicured hand to her chest, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. She let out a dramatic, trembling gasp that belonged on a soap opera set. "Maya," she whispered, her voice cracking with a fragile, manufactured emotion. "My beautiful, perfect little girl, we finally found you." She reached out her arms, opening wide as if to pull me into a desperate, motherly embrace. I took a sharp, desperate step back into the foyer. The movement was involuntary, a pure, visceral survival instinct kicking in. The heavy silence of the house pressed against my ears, making the blood roar in my head. "Don't touch me," I said. My voice was dangerously low, but it echoed off the marble floors behind me, sharp and absolute. Her theatrical, hurt expression sent a violent shudder through my chest. The carefully constructed walls in my mind, the mental barriers I had spent decades building through intensive therapy and sheer willpower, began to crack and splinter. Suddenly, the scent of expensive floral perfume on my porch faded entirely. It was abruptly replaced by the stinging, sterile scent of industrial bleach and cheap floor wax. I was 7 years old again. I remembered the freezing air conditioning in the back of Richard's luxury sedan. The dark leather seats had been stiff and uncomfortable against my bare legs. I had worn my favorite yellow sundress that day, the one with the little white daisies embroidered on the pockets. I had been so excited, genuinely believing we were going out for a special family trip to get ice cream. My older biological brother, Marcus Jr., sat beside me. He was the golden child, the prized son who could do no wrong. He played with a handheld video game, the bright screen illuminating his face, completely ignoring me. He didn't even bother to look up when the car pulled into the gravel parking lot of a grim brick building with heavy iron bars over the windows. I remembered the intake worker at the orphanage. She was a woman with kind but incredibly tired eyes, wearing a faded blue cardigan. She had offered me a broken red crayon and a coloring book with half the pages missing, trying to keep me distracted while my parents stood at the high wooden front desk. But I hadn't colored. I had clutched that broken red crayon in my tiny fist and listened to every word. "We can't take her with us," Richard had told the woman. His tone was brisk and casual, as if he were returning a defective appliance. "We only need the boy to carry on the family name. 2 children are a financial burden we simply aren't willing to carry right now, and a girl won't provide any return on our investment." The intake worker had looked absolutely appalled. Her pen hovered over the thick stack of surrender forms. "You're surrendering your daughter just like that because of her gender. It is a matter of legacy and practical economics," Eleanor had chimed in, adjusting her pearl earring with a look of mild boredom. "She is simply not a fit for our family's future. I am sure you will find someone else to take her off your hands." I remembered the red crayon slipping from my trembling fingers, hitting the linoleum floor with a hollow click. I remembered running to the heavy glass doors, pressing my small, frantic hands against the cold pane. I watched them walk casually back to the car. I watched Richard open the door for Marcus Jr., ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. I screamed until my throat bled. I begged them to come back, pleading with them not to leave me in that cold, bleach-scented place. The intake worker had to wrap her arms around my waist, holding me back as their taillights disappeared down the dusty road, taking my brother and my entire world with them. They had discarded me like trash because I wasn't born a boy. A warm, humid Georgia breeze rustled the massive magnolia trees in my front yard, snapping me back to the present moment. My heart was hammering against my ribs, wild and frantic. I dug my fingernails deep into my palms until the sharp, grounding pain cleared my mind. I forced myself to stand taller, blocking the doorway. I was not that helpless, unwanted little girl anymore. I was a woman who had fought tooth and nail for every single thing I possessed. I had been raised by Marcus Vance, a man who taught me resilience, business acumen, and the true meaning of unconditional love. I carried his immense strength within me, and I would not let these ghosts tear me down. I looked at Eleanor standing on my grand porch with her fake tears glistening in the afternoon sun. Beside her, Richard stood with his hands casually resting in the pockets of his expensive slacks. He offered a tight, polite smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "Maya, please," Eleanor whimpered, dabbing the corner of her eye with a pristine white tissue. "You have absolutely no idea the agony we have been through all these years. The sleepless nights, the endless tears. We have spent years desperately searching for you. Every single day I prayed to find my sweet daughter so we could finally reconnect our family." The sheer audacity of the lie made my blood run ice cold. It was a physical revulsion that twisted my stomach into hard knots. "You didn't search for me," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm, though a violent storm raged beneath the surface. "I spent my entire childhood bouncing around the broken foster system, feeling like nobody wanted me, until Marcus Vance finally took me in. If you had genuinely wanted to find me, you knew exactly which brick building you dumped me in 25 years ago." Richard stepped forward smoothly, adopting a soothing fatherly tone that made my skin crawl. "Now, Maya, let's not dwell on the painful past. We were young and foolish. We made incredibly difficult decisions under immense financial pressure. But we are here now. We want to make amends. We want to be a real family again." He shifted his weight, and as he did, his elbow bumped the thick, heavy leather briefcase hanging from his shoulder. The brass clasp was partially undone. My eyes drifted downward. A thick stack of crisp white legal documents poked out from the top compartment. I recognized the heavy legal-sized envelopes. I recognized the blue binding tape characteristic of aggressive court filings. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with sickening, devastating clarity. They hadn't hired a private investigator out of a sudden surge of parental guilt. They hadn't spent decades wrestling with the profound heartbreak of a missing child. They hadn't come to my doorstep to make amends or seek forgiveness. They had come because of Forbes magazine. 3 weeks ago, the publication ran a massive, highly publicized feature on the passing of Marcus Vance. My adoptive father was a legend, a self-made titan in the Atlanta commercial real estate market. The article extensively detailed his incredible legacy, his brilliant business strategies, and the sprawling empire he had built from nothing. It also prominently featured a full-page photo of me. It named me as his sole heir and the new CEO of Vance Enterprises. It explicitly detailed the estimated $50 million value of his primary personal estate, completely separate from the corporate holdings. I looked from the thick legal files in the briefcase back up to Richard's face. The polite fatherly mask was still firmly in place, but I could see the raw, predatory greed pooling in the depths of his dark eyes. They smelled money. They smelled my adoptive father's money. "You read the article," I stated. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Eleanor blinked, her theatrical tears instantly vanishing as her posture stiffened. "What article, sweetheart? We have absolutely no idea what you are talking about." "The Forbes piece," I said, taking a deliberate step forward. The suffocating grief in my chest suddenly ignited into a fierce, protective inferno of rage. My father died 6 months ago. The man who actually raised me. The man who paid for my education, who held my hand when I was sick, who taught me how to survive and thrive in this brutal world. He just died, and you read about his net worth in a magazine. Richard's polite smile faltered. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. "Marcus Vance was your adoptive father, Maya. He was a generous man, certainly. But we are your blood. We are your biological family. And blood matters." "Blood is a biological accident." I fired back, my voice vibrating with decades of suppressed anger. "You explicitly and willingly surrendered your parental rights to me 25 years ago. You threw me away like garbage because I was a girl. You do not get to show up on my porch now and pretend to care just because the little girl you discarded turned out to be profitable. We are your parents," Eleanor shouted, her voice losing its fragile, victimized edge entirely. It turned sharp, shrill, and viciously brittle. "You owe us some respect. We brought you into this world, Maya. You left me in an orphanage so you could carry on a family name with a son you decided was better than me," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "I owe you absolutely nothing. Get off my property immediately before I call my security team and have you dragged off." I grabbed the brass handle, moving to slam the heavy oak door in their faces. I wanted to shut them out, to lock the deadbolt and return to the quiet, dark sanctuary of my morning. I wanted to call my corporate attorney and tell her to file a restraining order to ensure these vultures never came near my estate again. But Richard was faster. He thrust his polished dress shoe into the doorway, physically blocking the heavy wood from closing. The expensive leather scraped harshly against my pristine marble threshold. The polite, concerned, fatherly facade melted away completely, revealing the ugly truth underneath. The faux warmth in his eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute ruthlessness. This was the man who had traded his 7-year-old daughter away without a single second thought. This was the true face of the monster from my childhood nightmares. He unclasped his leather briefcase entirely and reached inside. He didn't pull out a cherished childhood photo. He didn't pull out a heartfelt handwritten letter of apology. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents I had spotted earlier. With a sudden aggressive motion, he shoved the heavy bundle of papers hard into my chest. I reflexively brought my hands up to catch them, the sharp paper edges of the manila envelope biting into my palms. "We aren't here for a tearful reunion, Maya," Richard announced, his voice echoing like cracking ice in the humid Atlanta air. "We are suing for 50% of Marcus Vance's $50 million estate, and as your biological parents, we are legally entitled to every single penny." I stood frozen in the doorway of the executive boardroom, staring at the impossible scene unfolding in front of me. Marcus Jr. was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. He was leaning back in my leather chair, his hands steepled under his chin, wearing a tailored designer suit that was undoubtedly purchased with my biological parents' dwindling credit cards. Charles Montgomery, the oldest and most vocal member of the board, cleared his throat from the side of the table. He didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye. "Have a seat, Maya," Charles said, gesturing to a plain, uncomfortable guest chair near the door. "That is my chair," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, but echoing clearly against the glass walls. Marcus Jr. offered a smile that dripped with practiced condescension. "Not anymore, little sister. The board and I have just been having a very enlightening conversation about the true hidden state of Vance Enterprises." Sarah stepped forward, her sharp lawyer instincts instantly flaring to life. "This meeting is completely unauthorized. Marcus has absolutely no legal standing in this building, and you all know it." The high-profile attorney my biological parents had hired stepped out from the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling windows. He dropped a thick, heavy stack of glossy folders onto the center of the mahogany table. "He has every right as an interested party in the frozen estate," the lawyer said, smoothing his silk tie. "Especially since we've just presented undeniable evidence that Marcus Vance was not of sound mind when he appointed Maya as his sole successor." My breath caught sharply in my throat. Marcus Vance had been the sharpest, most brilliant man I ever knew, right up until the very second his heart gave out. Marcus Jr. opened one of the folders and slid it toward Charles. "We have medical records. Doctor's notes indicating severe cognitive decline in his final months. Notes you conveniently kept hidden from the board, Maya, while you manipulated a dying senile man into signing over his entire empire to you." "That is an absolute lie," I fired back, stepping aggressively toward the table. "Those documents have to be entirely fabricated. My father was perfectly lucid. He built this company with his own two hands." Charles finally looked up, his eyes cold, calculating, and entirely skeptical. "The documents look highly compelling to us, Maya, and given the sudden freeze on all corporate accounts, this company requires stable, untainted leadership immediately. You're falling for a desperate con," I told the board, looking pleadingly at the men and women my adoptive father had trusted for decades. "He failed at 3 different tech startups. He is drowning in personal debt. He's using you to save himself." "He is blood," Charles retorted sharply, his tone ending the discussion. "And right now, biological blood looks a lot more reliable than an adopted girl who took advantage of an old man's declining mental state." The boardroom mutiny was a total disaster, but it was only the first wave of their coordinated attack. By the time Sarah and I retreated to her cramped temporary workspace on a lower floor, the real nightmare was already broadcasting across the entire city. Sarah handed me her tablet. Her hand was visibly shaking. "You need to see this," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "It's playing on every single local news channel." I hit play on the digital screen. The video showed my biological parents, Richard and Eleanor, sitting close together on a plush couch in a local television studio. Eleanor was wearing a modest, muted sweater, looking entirely different from the aggressively impeccable woman who had shown up on my front porch. She held a crumpled tissue in her hands, her eyes red, puffy, and brimming with manufactured tears. We just wanted to see our little girl. Eleanor sobbed to the camera, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. We spent 25 agonizing years looking for her, praying for her every single night. And when we finally found her, she threw us out like absolute garbage. The interviewer leaned in, his expression heavy with practiced sympathy. And what about the audio recording, Eleanor? The one your legal team submitted to the courts? My stomach plummeted straight into the floor. The screen cut to a stark black graphic displaying a pulsing sound wave. It was my voice echoing from our brutal confrontation on my front porch, but it had been spliced and maliciously edited with terrifying precision. I owe you absolutely nothing, my recorded voice hissed from the tablet speakers. I only care about the money. Get off my property before I have you dragged off. They had expertly cut out everything about the orphanage. They had deleted the part where they shoved a $50 million lawsuit into my chest. They manipulated the audio to make me sound like a greedy, heartless monster who only cared about hoarding a stolen fortune. She manipulated her adoptive father just like she's manipulating the courts. Richard told the camera, playing the role of the heartbroken, earnest father flawlessly. We are only fighting this painful legal battle to save Marcus Vance's incredible legacy from a deeply disturbed, greedy young woman. I dropped the tablet onto the wooden desk. The glass screen cracked sharply against the edge, but I barely registered the sound. The air in Sarah's office suddenly felt incredibly thick and suffocating. A violent tremor started in my hands and traveled rapidly straight up my arms, settling deep in my chest. It's a massive smear campaign, Sarah said, pacing the small room frantically. It is highly coordinated. They hired a ruthless crisis PR firm. They want to completely destroy your public image, so the board has no choice but to permanently remove you from the company. They are destroying my life, I whispered, barely able to find my voice. Suddenly, my phone started vibrating endlessly against the desk. It was a torrential, unending flood of notifications. Vance Enterprises' top commercial vendors were calling. Major construction contractors were leaving frantic voicemails. The messages were all exactly the same. They had seen the news broadcast. They had heard about the frozen accounts and the boardroom chaos. They were citing morality clauses, expressing deep concern about the fraud allegations, and pulling their multi-million-dollar contracts effective immediately. I walked over to the window on unsteady legs and looked down at the street level. A large crowd was already gathering outside the corporate headquarters. People were holding hastily made cardboard signs. I couldn't read the specific words from this high up, but the angry, surging hostile energy of the mob was undeniable. The local media had painted a massive target on my back, and the public was eagerly taking aim. The sheer crushing weight of the betrayal pressed down on my chest until I physically couldn't pull a full breath into my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping to block out the reality of my collapsing empire. But the darkness offered absolutely no relief. Instead, the smell of expensive office cologne faded, replaced instantly by the stinging, sterile scent of industrial bleach and cheap floor wax. I wasn't the powerful CEO of Vance Enterprises anymore. I was a terrified, unwanted 7-year-old girl standing in a cold orphanage hallway, watching taillights disappear down a dusty road. I felt exactly like that little girl again. Discarded, worthless, utterly alone in a cruel world that had collectively decided I wasn't good enough to keep. Maya, look at me, Sarah said, grabbing my shoulders tightly. Her firm grip pierced through the rising fog of my panic attack. We are going to fight this. I am drafting a cease and desist order right now. We will find proof that the audio is doctored. We will expose them. The accounts are totally frozen, Sarah, I said, my voice hollow and defeated. We can't pay a forensic audio expert to prove anything. We can't even pay our own private security team. Go home, Sarah ordered gently, giving my shoulders a reassuring squeeze. You haven't slept in days. You look like you're going to collapse. The board has barred you from the executive floor anyway. Go back to the estate, rest. Let me handle the legal fires here for a few hours. I didn't want to leave her to fight alone, but my body was physically failing me. My vision blurred heavily at the edges, and a brutal throbbing headache hammered relentlessly behind my eyes. I managed to slip out through the building's underground parking garage, carefully avoiding the angry crowd and the aggressive news vans swarming the main glass entrance. The drive back to my sprawling Atlanta estate was a dangerous blur of pure exhaustion and numb, silent tears. I just wanted the dark, quiet safety of my home. I desperately needed to sit in my adoptive father's old, worn leather armchair and try to remember what it felt like to be loved, protected, and safe. I turned my car onto the long, winding, tree-lined driveway of the estate seeking sanctuary. But the heavy iron security gates were wide open. My foot hit the brake instinctively, jerking the car. The private security guards who usually manned the front booth were gone. The small brick guardhouse was completely empty and dark. A cold, twisting knot of dread formed deep in the pit of my stomach. I eased the car slowly up the long driveway, the tires crunching loudly and ominously against the gravel. As my grand white-pillared home finally came into view, the remaining breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. Smeared across the pristine, heavy oak front doors in thick, dripping, violent red spray paint was a single devastating word: fraud. I threw the car into park and stumbled blindly out into the humid evening air. My legs felt like lead weights as I forced myself to walk up the marble steps of my own porch. The red paint was still slightly wet, glistening menacingly under the warm glow of the porch lights. But it wasn't the hateful vandalism that made my blood run ice cold and stopped my heart from beating. Taped directly over the brass handle of my front door, secured tightly with heavy blue legal tape, was a crisp, formal white document. I reached out with a violently trembling hand and peeled the heavy paper off the wood. It was a court-ordered eviction notice signed by the presiding judge, demanding I vacate the premises immediately. I stared at the crisp white document in my trembling hands, the sharp blue legal tape stubbornly clinging to my fingers. The word blurred and shifted as a cold, paralyzing numbness washed over my entire body. Eviction. I wasn't just losing control of the boardroom, I was losing my sanctuary. Before I could even process the heavy legal jargon printed on the page, the harsh crunch of tires on gravel echoed behind me. 3 vehicles pulled up my long, winding driveway, cutting through the humid evening air. 2 were marked county sheriff cruisers, their lights off, but their presence unmistakable. The third was a sleek black town car. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out of the town car, flanked immediately by 2 armed deputies. He walked up the marble steps of my porch with an arrogant, unhurried stride. He didn't even glance at the red graffiti dripping down my front doors. He just looked directly at me, his expression entirely devoid of empathy. "Maya Vance," he said, handing me a duplicate stack of thick legal papers. "I am Arthur Sterling. The presiding judge has officially appointed me as the third-party receiver for Vance Enterprises and the entirety of the Marcus Vance estate effective immediately." "You can't do this," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly small and fragile in the dark. "This is my home. This is my father's house. This property is now a contested corporate asset," Arthur corrected smoothly, adjusting his expensive tie. "The judge has ruled temporarily in favor of your biological parents' injunction. Until the trial concludes, you are officially stripped of your CEO title, and your access to all corporate and personal accounts has been entirely suspended. You have exactly 2 hours to gather your personal effects and vacate the premises." 2 hours. 25 years of memories of absolute safety, of building a life with the only father who ever truly loved me, reduced to a ticking clock. The deputies followed me inside, their heavy boots echoing on the hardwood floors like a death march. They stood in the doorway of my master bedroom, their hands resting on their belts, watching my every move to ensure I didn't take any valuable estate assets. The sheer humiliation of being monitored in my own bedroom burned my throat. I pulled a single battered suitcase from the back of my closet. My hands shook so violently I could barely work the zipper. What do you pack when your entire existence is being stolen out from under you? I didn't reach for the designer shoes, the expensive jewelry, or the tailored business suits that defined my corporate armor. I grabbed comfortable clothes, practical shoes, and basic toiletries. I grabbed the framed photograph of Marcus and me from my college graduation, the one where he was smiling so wide it looked like his face might break. Then I walked over to my heavy oak nightstand. Resting in the bottom drawer was my adoptive father's old worn leather journal. It was a thick, heavy book with a scuffed brown cover. He used to sit in his armchair by the fireplace, drinking black coffee and scribbling his private thoughts, business strategies, and daily reflections into these pages. The leather smelled faintly of his cologne and old paper. I clutched it tightly to my chest, closing my eyes, desperately needing to feel his strength one last time. "Time is up, Miss Vance," Arthur's voice called sharply from the hallway. I placed the journal carefully into the suitcase and zipped it shut. Walking out the front door was the hardest thing I have ever done. The humid Georgia air felt heavy and suffocating against my skin. I handed over my house keys to Arthur, watching him drop them carelessly into his jacket pocket. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind me, the sound vibrating in my chest like a physical blow. I climbed into my car, praying the gas tank was full because my credit cards were now completely useless pieces of plastic. I drove down the long, tree-lined driveway, watching my beautiful, sprawling home shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely into the darkness. I had nowhere else to go, penniless and officially homeless. I showed up at Sarah's apartment building just after midnight. When she opened her door and saw me standing in the dimly lit hallway with a single suitcase looking like a shattered ghost, she didn't ask a single question. She didn't offer legal advice or false hope. She just pulled me into a fierce, tight hug and let me cry against her shoulder until my voice gave out entirely. The next 3 days were a dark, suffocating blur. I hit absolute rock bottom. The massive empire I had helped Marcus build, the incredible legacy he had trusted me to protect, was being systematically dismantled by the very people who threw me away at a cold, sterile orphanage. I crashed on Sarah's living room couch, completely paralyzed by the profound injustice of it all. The depression was a heavy physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to pull a full breath into my lungs, let alone stand up and fight. I barely moved. I barely ate. I spent hours just staring blankly at the ceiling, feeling exactly like that unwanted 7-year-old girl again. Discarded, powerless, completely alone. Sarah tried desperately to keep the fight alive. She converted her small kitchen table into a makeshift war room, constantly on the phone, drafting emergency appeals and trying to find a sympathetic judge who would listen to reason. But every afternoon she brought nothing but devastating news. "Arthur Sterling is freezing us out completely," Sarah said on the third evening, dropping her laptop onto the table with a deeply frustrated sigh. "He is already approving massive rapid liquidations of company assets. Marcus Jr. is treating the frozen corporate accounts like his own personal piggy bank, taking huge executive advances, and Arthur is letting him do it without a second thought." I pulled the fleece blanket tighter around my shoulders, staring blankly at the television screen. "They are going to completely destroy the company before we even get a chance to step inside a courtroom." "We need resources, Maya," Sarah said softly, sitting on the edge of the coffee table right in front of me. "We cannot fight a high-profile, multi-million-dollar legal battle with absolutely zero capital. We can't even afford to hire an independent forensic accountant to prove Marcus Jr. is bleeding the accounts dry." She was entirely right. I was completely defenseless. The wolves had broken down the door and I had absolutely nothing left to fight them with. Sarah eventually went to bed, leaving me alone in the dim orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the living room blinds. The silence of the small apartment was maddening. It left far too much room for the memories of my birth parents' smug faces, of the screaming protesters, holding signs calling me a fraud, of the cold leather seats in Richard's car all those years ago. Needing a distraction, needing any connection to the man who actually loved me and chose me. I reached down into my open suitcase. My fingers brushed against the familiar worn leather of Marcus's journal. I pulled it out and rested it on my lap. The leather cover was incredibly soft from years of constant use. I ran my hand over the binding, tracing the deep creases and physical imperfections. Tears blurred my vision heavily as I slowly opened the book. The pages were filled with his sharp, slanted handwriting. He had written extensively about property acquisitions, hostile zoning meetings, and commercial interest rates. But mixed in between the brutal business notes were small, quiet reflections about me. Maya aced her finance exam today. She has a brilliant, terrifying mind. She is going to be an absolute force of nature. A choked, painful sob escaped my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, hugging the open journal tightly to my chest. The agonizing pain of losing him was still so incredibly raw, and the crushing guilt of losing his company was tearing me apart from the inside. I felt like I had failed the only person who ever believed in me. I shifted my weight on the couch, running my thumb absent-mindedly along the thick inner spine of the book to smooth down the pages. Suddenly, I felt something strange. The back cover felt unusually stiff and uneven. I opened my eyes, wiping away the tears, and looked closely at the inside binding. There was a clean, incredibly precise slit, cut deep into the leather backing. It was practically invisible, hidden perfectly in the natural fold of the book, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to press. My heart gave a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I slipped my index finger into the narrow opening. The leather separated slightly, revealing a hollowed-out pocket completely concealed within the thick back cover. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. My hands began to tremble violently as I pinched the edge of something smooth and flat, hidden deep inside the leather. I carefully pulled it out. It was a thick, heavy, cream-colored envelope sealed tightly with dark red wax. I held it up to the dim light spilling through the window, my pulse suddenly hammering in my ears with a wild, frantic energy. Written across the front of the envelope in my adoptive father's unmistakable slanted handwriting was a single label. For my daughter, when the wolves circle. My thumb slipped under the flap of the heavy cream envelope, breaking the dark red wax seal with a sharp, brittle snap. My hands were shaking so violently that the paper rattled in the quiet, dim living room. Inside, I found two things. The first was a single folded piece of thick stationery. The second was a heavy antique brass key that slipped from the folds and hit my lap with a dull, heavy thud. I carefully unfolded the stationery. The familiar slanted handwriting of Marcus Vance jumped off the page. Looking at his perfectly pressed ink, I could almost hear his deep, rumbling voice filling the silent apartment, offering me the shelter I so desperately needed. "My dearest Maya," the letter began. "If you are reading this, the worst has happened, and I am no longer there to protect you. You are likely facing a brutal storm you never saw coming, and the wolves are already at your door. I always knew there was a minor, obscure vulnerability in the original trust documents, an archaic bloodline clause that I couldn't legally erase without drawing unwanted, dangerous attention to it." My breath caught painfully in my throat. He knew. My adoptive father had always known that the people who threw me away might eventually resurface to exploit his empire. "I could never leave you defenseless," the letter continued. "For the last 5 years of my life, I have been quietly liquidating certain offshore assets and funneling them into a completely independent shadow corporation. It is registered under an ironclad shell company. It is entirely separate from Vance Enterprises and utterly untouchable by any probate court hostile board or emergency injunction. The key in your lap unlocks safe deposit box 804 at the First Fidelity Private Vault downtown. Go there. Put on your armor. Fight back. A single hot tear slipped down my cheek, hitting the edge of the parchment. The heavy, suffocating depression that had paralyzed me on Sarah's couch for 3 days vanished in an instant. It was replaced by a fierce, burning warmth that radiated outward from my chest. Marcus was still protecting me. Even from the grave, he was handing me a sword. "Sarah," I called out, my voice cracking the dead silence of the early morning. I stood up from the couch, letting the fleece blanket fall carelessly to the floor. I walked rapidly to the guest bedroom and pushed the door open. Sarah was already sitting up in bed, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, alarmed by the sudden urgency in my tone. "What time is it?" she mumbled, squinting at the harsh light spilling from the hallway. "Get dressed," I said, holding up the heavy brass key so it glinted in the light. "My father left us a war chest." 2 hours later, we were standing inside the sterile, hyper-secure lobby of First Fidelity Private Vault in downtown Atlanta. The air in the facility was cool, hushed, and smelled faintly of polished marble and expensive security. The private bank manager didn't ask us a single question. He simply checked the brass key, meticulously verified my identity credentials, and escorted us down a quiet, carpeted hallway deep into the underground vault. He led us into a private, soundproof viewing room featuring a heavy oak table. He placed a long, reinforced metal box in the center of the wood, offered a polite nod, and quietly shut the door behind him. The electronic lock clicked heavily into place, sealing us inside. I stared down at the metal box. This was the turning point. I wasn't just a grieving, evicted daughter anymore. I certainly wasn't that helpless, unwanted 7-year-old girl waiting in a sterile orphanage hallway to be discarded. I took a deep, grounding breath, inserted the brass key into the lock, and turned it. I flipped the heavy lid back. The box was packed to the absolute brim. There were thick, leather-bound folders filled with incorporation documents and impenetrable corporate shielding agreements. There were physical deeds to high-yield commercial real estate properties scattered across the state, completely unlisted in the main Vance portfolio. There were heavy black USB drives containing offshore bank account access codes detailing millions of dollars in untraceable liquid assets. Sarah carefully pulled out one of the master financial ledgers, her eyes rapidly scanning the dense columns of numbers. Her jaw practically unhinged. "Maya," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute shock. "This isn't just a comfortable safety net. This is a massive, aggressive fortune. He gave you enough capital to buy out half the hostile board members at Vance Enterprises straight out of pocket. You are completely liquid. You have more leverage right now than Richard and Eleanor could ever dream of." I ran my fingertips over the crisp legal documents. The victimized, defeated mindset that had chained me to Sarah's couch evaporated completely, leaving behind an icy, unbreakable resolve. The paralyzing fear was entirely gone. I was the true chosen CEO of my father's empire, and I was finally ready to go to war. "They think they left me with absolutely nothing," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, calculated tone that echoed off the metal walls of the vault. "They think I'm bleeding out on the street begging for mercy. Let them believe it. We are going to use this capital to build an invisible trap." As I reached deeper into the metal box to safely gather the offshore account drives, my hand brushed against a thick, sealed manila folder wedged at the very bottom. It was heavy, wrapped tightly in security wire and labeled in stark, printed black letters. "Richard and Eleanor. Background dossier." My pulse spiked wildly. My adoptive father hadn't just secured my financial future, he had hired elite private investigators to dig relentlessly into the lives of the people who abandoned me. He had spent years quietly compiling a weaponized, comprehensive file on my biological parents, anticipating the exact battle I was currently fighting. I pulled the heavy folder out and placed it flat on the oak table. Sarah immediately moved to my side, her legal instincts flaring to life. We opened the thick cover together, flipping through dozens of pages of surveillance logs, heavily detailed credit reports, and deep-dive financial histories. It was a masterclass in private intelligence gathering. You were completely right about their crushing debts. I noted scanning a summarized credit report from 3 years ago. They've been drowning in missed mortgages and defaulted high-interest loans for a decade. Marcus Jr.'s string of failed tech startups completely drained their remaining retirement funds. They don't have a single legitimate asset to their name. But look at this page, Sarah said, pointing a trembling manicured finger at a recent bank statement included in the investigator's file. This doesn't make any logical sense. If their credit is completely destroyed and they are weeks away from total irreversible bankruptcy, how are they funding this massive lawsuit? They hired Arthur Sterling. He is one of the most expensive, ruthless estate litigators in the entire state. He doesn't get out of bed for less than a six-figure retainer. I frowned, flipping to the next glossy page of the report. The private investigators had expertly tracked a series of massive, untraceable cash deposits entering Richard's primary checking account just 2 months prior to my adoptive father's death. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars in raw cash used immediately to pay Sterling's retainer fees and secure the aggressive, costly injunction against my estate. Where did they get $250,000 in liquid cash? I asked, leaning closer to the document to verify the staggering numbers. Sarah quickly flipped to the back of the dossier, finding the lead investigator's final summarized conclusion regarding the mysterious cash deposits. She read the paragraph in silence, her eyes widening in absolute unadulterated horror. Maya, Sarah said, the color completely draining from her face as she looked up at me. They didn't get a secure bank loan. They didn't sell a hidden property. Then where is the money coming from? The private investigator tracked the wire transfers back through a complex network of shady shell companies, Sarah explained, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Richard and Eleanor are completely broke. To fund this expensive legal attack against you, they embezzled $250,000 from a highly dangerous, violent local loan shark. The fluorescent light of the cheap rented co-working space flickered erratically overhead, humming with a low, annoying buzz. I sat in a wobbly plastic chair, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. Just a few days ago, I had been sitting in a custom leather chair in the penthouse suite of Vance Enterprises. Now I was crammed into a 10 by 10 glass cubicle that smelled faintly of stale coffee and cheap printer ink. But the aesthetic didn't matter anymore. The numbers on my screen were all that mattered. Wire transfer confirmed, Sarah whispered, her eyes glued to her own monitor. $3 million just cleared from the Shadow Trust into our new untraceable LLC. We are completely liquid, Maya. I leaned back, feeling a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. My biological parents thought they had left me bleeding out on the street. They thought taking my home and freezing my father's public assets had rendered me completely powerless. They had absolutely no idea that Marcus Vance had spent 5 years quietly arming me for this exact war. It is time to go on the offensive, I said, my voice cold and steady. I want the best private intelligence firm in the state. And I want a crisis PR team that specializes in destroying reputations, not just protecting them. Within 48 hours, our cramped cubicle transformed into a high-stakes underground war room. I used the shadow funds to hire Elias Thorne, a ruthless former federal investigator who now ran an elite corporate intelligence firm. I didn't want him to just look at my birth family's public records. I wanted him to tear up the floorboards of their entire existence. Elias stood in our tiny office on a rainy Tuesday morning, dropping a massive, heavily indexed binder onto the cheap folding table. You were right about the loan shark, Elias said, his gravelly voice dropping low. Richard and Eleanor didn't just borrow $250,000. They laundered it, and they used their golden boy to do it. I opened the binder, scanning the highlighted financial routing numbers. Show me. The loan shark is a man named Victor Rossi, Elias explained, pointing to a complex web of wire transfers. He is incredibly violent and strictly off the grid. Richard and Eleanor took the cash from Victor, then funneled it directly through two of Marcus Jr.'s failing tech startups. They disguised the embezzled money as seed investments, then immediately withdrew it to pay for the high-profile lawyers currently suing you. Sarah let out a sharp, incredulous breath. They used their son's businesses to launder organized crime money. If Victor Rossi finds out they are using his cash to fight a probate battle instead of flipping it for a profit, he won't take them to civil court. He will break their legs. And what is Marcus Jr. doing right now? I asked, tracing his name on the financial web. Living like a king, Elias replied with a look of pure disgust. Arthur Sterling, the court-appointed receiver, is approving massive executive advances from your frozen corporate accounts. Marcus Jr. just bought a new Porsche and leased a luxury penthouse downtown. He is throwing lavish premature victory parties every single night. My jaw tightened. They were drinking expensive champagne paid for by the empire my adoptive father built with his own blood, sweat, and tears. The anger burned hot in my chest, but I forced it down into something cold and sharp. Anger is sloppy. Leverage is precise. Let them party, I told Elias. I want to make sure Marcus Jr. keeps spending. Set up a dummy corporation. Create a fake, highly lucrative commercial real estate development in the warehouse district. Make it look like a quiet, exclusive buy-in. Sarah looked up from her screen, catching on immediately. You want to bait him? He is arrogant and he honestly thinks he is a business genius. I said, a dark satisfaction coating my words. Feed the fake opportunity to his social circle. Make it look so good he can't possibly resist. He will drain the frozen estate funds to buy into it, thinking he is going to double his money. He won't realize he is handing my father's money right back into my shadow accounts. While Elias set the trap for my brother, I turned my absolute attention to the corporate traitors who had abandoned me. The public smear campaign my biological parents launched was still raging on the local news. Protesters still occasionally gathered outside the glass doors of Vance Enterprises. Whenever I walked from my car to the co-working space, I made sure to look entirely defeated. I wore oversized hoodies, kept my head down, and let the paparazzi snap pathetic photos of the broken, evicted CEO. The illusion of my surrender was my greatest weapon. I pulled up the list of major commercial vendors and construction contractors who had cited the fraud allegations and pulled their multi-million-dollar contracts last week. They had panicked, choosing self-preservation over loyalty to the Vance name. I didn't call their public relations departments. I didn't beg for my contracts back. Using my new anonymous LLC, I quietly reached out to the aggressive private equity firms holding their corporate debt. My first target was Apex Construction, the company that had walked away from a $50 million waterfront development project. I sat in a private leased conference room across from David Thorne, the CEO of Apex. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight in his seat. He thought he was meeting with a new anonymous investor to discuss his company's struggling credit lines. When I walked through the door instead, all the color drained instantly from his face. Maya, David stammered, attempting to stand up. I thought you were locked out. The news said you were completely bankrupt. The news says a lot of things, David, I replied, taking the seat at the head of the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I am the majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings, and as of this morning, Vanguard Holdings just purchased 80% of your company's outstanding debt. David stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. You bought our debt. I bought all of it. I corrected, smoothly sliding a thick legal folder across the polished wood. When things got difficult, you abandoned my father's legacy. You aligned yourself with the people trying to destroy me. So now I legally own your company's survival. He swallowed hard, sweat beading heavily on his forehead. What do you want, Maya? I don't just want the waterfront contract reinstated, I said, leaning forward so he could see the absolute zero in my eyes. I want your absolute, unquestioning loyalty. When I take back my boardroom, you are going to publicly state that my biological brother tried to bribe you. You are going to back my play entirely, or I will call in every single cent of your debt tomorrow morning and liquidate Apex Construction by Friday." David looked at the documents, then back at me. He saw exactly what Marcus Vance had forged me to be. "You have my loyalty, Maya. Whatever you need." I spent the next week repeating that exact same conversation with every vendor, every client, and every contractor who had turned their backs on me. From the shadows of my tiny co-working space, I systematically bought their debts and secured their absolute compliance. I was rebuilding my power base from the underground, wrapping an invisible steel net around my own company. Meanwhile, Elias's trap worked flawlessly. Marcus Jr., desperate to prove his financial genius to his new social circle, used the court-appointed receiver to authorize a massive $8 million withdrawal from the frozen Vance estate. He invested every single penny into our dummy commercial development, convinced he was going to make a fortune. He willingly walked right into the cage and locked the door behind himself. The pieces were all perfectly aligning. My biological family was dancing recklessly on a trap door, and my hand was resting firmly on the lever. Late on a Friday evening, Sarah and I were finalizing the offshore routing protocols when the heavy glass door to our co-working office clicked open. Elias stepped inside. He didn't have a thick binder this time. He moved with a sudden rigid urgency, locking the door behind him and pulling the privacy blinds shut. "What is it?" I asked, standing up from my chair, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy. Elias didn't say a word. He walked directly over to my desk and reached into his jacket pocket. "I put surveillance on Arthur Sterling, the third-party receiver managing your estate." Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. "I thought he was just incompetent for approving Marcus Jr.'s wild spending. I was wrong." Sarah came around the desk, her eyes wide with sudden alarm. "What did you find, Elias?" Elias placed a small black flash drive directly next to my keyboard. He looked at me, a grim, triumphant satisfaction settling over his weathered features. "It is undeniable high-definition video and audio evidence," Elias stated clearly. "I just caught your birth parents actively bribing the court-appointed receiver managing your estate." I stared at the glowing screen of Elias's laptop, watching the undeniable high-definition footage play out. Richard and Eleanor were sliding a thick, unmarked envelope across a steakhouse table directly to Arthur Sterling. The court-appointed receiver managing my entire estate slipped the bribe into his briefcase with a practiced, casual ease. Sarah let out a sharp, incredulous breath. That footage alone was enough to send all three of them to federal prison. But Elias didn't look triumphant. The weathered former federal investigator reached into his jacket and pulled out a second, much older manila folder. It looked worn, the edges yellowed with age. "The bribery footage is your leverage to take back the company," Elias said, his gravelly voice dropping to a somber whisper. "But when I traced the money laundering, I started noticing anomalies in their financial history from exactly 25 years ago. I dug into the orphanage records. I found the original intake worker." My heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. The sterile, bleach-scented air of that brick building rushed back into my memory. "What did you find, Elias?" He didn't speak. He just slowly opened the aged folder and pushed a series of incredibly old, heavily redacted bank statements across the cheap folding table. 25 years ago, Richard and Eleanor weren't just struggling, Elias explained gently. They were drowning. They owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to private creditors. They were weeks away from losing their house, their cars, and their precious social status. I frowned, scanning the faded ink on the documents. They told the intake worker that keeping 2 children was a financial burden. They said I wouldn't provide a return on their investment. "That wasn't the whole truth, Maya," Sarah said. She was looking at a different document, her face completely drained of color, Her hands were shaking. Elias slid a final piece of paper toward me. It was a copy of a wire transfer receipt dated 3 days before I was left at the orphanage. The transfer was for a staggering amount of money routed through a notorious offshore account directly into Richard's primary checking. The orphanage they left you at wasn't a standard state facility, Elias stated, his voice heavy with suppressed anger. It was a front, a corrupt black market adoption ring disguised as a religious charity. Wealthy families paid massive under-the-table premiums to bypass state waiting lists. The air in the cramped co-working space suddenly felt dangerously thin. My ears began to ring with a high, sharp whine. They didn't just abandon you because you were a girl, Maya, Elias said softly. The broker running that facility paid them a massive off-the-books cash settlement to relinquish their parental rights. They didn't leave you. They sold you. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. I pushed my plastic chair back, stumbling away from the table. My knees hit the edge of a filing cabinet, but I barely felt the impact. Sold. The word echoed in my mind, deafening and absolute. All my life I had carried the agonizing burden of believing I was simply unwanted. I thought I was discarded because I was the wrong gender, because I was a burden, because I wasn't good enough to love. But the reality was infinitely more monstrous. I was inventory. I was a commodity. I was the emergency asset they liquidated to save their precious, fragile pride. I remembered sitting in the back of Richard's cold luxury sedan in my yellow sundress. I remembered Marcus Jr. playing his video game, completely ignoring me. They had already cashed the check. The money was already in their bank account when they drove me to that brick building. Every single tear I had shed, every nightmare that plagued my childhood, was the direct result of a calculated, lucrative financial transaction. A visceral, agonizing pain tore open my chest. It felt like a fresh, bleeding wound, deeper than anything I had ever experienced. I sank to the floor of the glass cubicle, pressing my hands over my face as a ragged, suffocating sob ripped through my throat. Sarah was beside me in an instant. She dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms tightly around my shaking shoulders. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell me it was going to be okay. She just held me, letting me shatter completely onto the cheap carpet. I cried for the terrified 7-year-old girl who had screamed until her throat bled. I cried for the years I had spent wondering why my own mother couldn't love me. I cried until my lungs burned and my vision blurred with exhaustion. But as the tears finally began to slow, something profound shifted deep within my chest. The agonizing, paralyzing grief slowly began to cool. It hardened, compressing into something dense, heavy, and absolutely unbreakable. The suffocating sadness evaporated, replaced entirely by an icy, calculated, and terrifying rage. I opened my eyes. I stared at the yellowed wire transfer receipt sitting on the table above me. The current lawsuit, the emergency injunction, the public smear campaign on local television. The puzzle pieces locked together with absolute sickening clarity. They are doing it again, I whispered, my voice sounding completely foreign. It was lethal and perfectly steady. Sarah pulled back slightly, looking at my face. What? 25 years ago, they used my existence to save themselves from bankruptcy, I said slowly, pulling myself up from the floor. I didn't feel weak anymore. I felt dangerous. And now that Marcus Jr. has drained them dry, and they owe money to a violent loan shark, they are doing the exact same thing. They saw my face in Forbes magazine and they saw a paycheck. They are trying to cash in on my life one last time. Elias watched me carefully, recognizing the total shift in my demeanor. You have the evidence to destroy them, Maya. The bribery footage will put them in prison. The adoption records will ruin whatever is left of their public image. You can hand this all over to the authorities right now. No, I commanded, wiping the last remaining tear from my cheek. Going to the police right now is too easy. If they get arrested today, they can still play the victim. They can claim the evidence is fabricated. They can hide behind their expensive PR firm and Arthur Sterling's legal shielding. I walked over to the desk and picked up the wire transfer receipt. I traced the massive monetary figure printed on the aged paper. "They took everything from me," I said, my voice vibrating with decades of suppressed fury. "They stole my home, my company, and my father's legacy. They sprayed the word fraud on my front door. They sold me like livestock. I don't just want them in a courtroom. I want them to feel the exact same absolute crushing terror I felt when they left me in that orphanage." Sarah stood up, her legal mind instantly aligning with my strategy. The shock on her face had morphed into a fierce, protective determination. "What is the play, Maya?" "The time for hiding in the shadows is completely over," I stated, looking between Sarah and Elias. "We are going to tighten the noose. I want them paranoid. I want them turning on each other. I want them to realize that the little girl they sold has grown up to be their executioner, and there is absolutely nothing they can do to stop it. I'll start calling in the debts we bought from your vendors," Sarah said, a dark satisfaction lacing her words. "We can legally bankrupt Marcus Jr. by Friday." "Do it," I ordered. "And Elias, I want you to arrange a private meeting with Arthur Sterling. Send him a single frame of the bribery video. Let him know we have him dead to rights. He is going to become our inside man, or he is going to lose his law license and his freedom. Consider it done." Elias nodded, packing the files back into his heavy briefcase. The fluorescent lights of the co-working space buzzed overhead. For the first time since my adoptive father passed away, I didn't feel the crushing weight of grief. I felt an incredible surging power. Marcus Vance had forged me into a weapon, and my biological parents had just willingly stepped directly into my line of fire. I picked up my cell phone from the desk. I opened a secure, untraceable messaging application that Elias had installed for me earlier in the week. I carefully laid the 25-year-old wire transfer receipt flat on the table. I positioned my phone camera over the aged paper, making sure the date, the routing numbers, and the massive cash amount were in perfect, undeniable focus. The proof of my sale, the definitive evidence of their monstrous greed. I took the photograph. I attached the image to a new message, typing in Richard's personal cell phone number. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. I didn't write a long, emotional paragraph. I didn't demand an explanation or hurl insults. I wanted to deliver a psychological strike that would absolutely shatter his arrogant fatherly facade. I typed 6 simple words. I hit send, watching the delivery confirmation flash across the screen. Somewhere in a luxury rented penthouse surrounded by the stolen wealth of my adoptive father, my biological father's phone was about to chime. He was about to look down at his screen, expecting a message from his lawyers or a notification from his bank. Instead, he would see the receipt for the daughter he sold, accompanied by a message sent from an untraceable ghost. "I know what you did." TikTok. Elias tapped the screen of his laptop, pulling up the live feed from the hidden camera his team had discreetly installed across the street from my biological parents' rented penthouse. I leaned over his shoulder, watching the silent, high-definition drama unfold. Richard was pacing frantically back and forth across the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was gripping his cell phone so tightly his knuckles were white. Eleanor sat frozen on a velvet sofa, her face buried in her hands. They had received the photograph of the 25-year-old wire transfer. The absolute panic radiating from the screen was palpable. The arrogant, composed facade they had maintained in the media was completely gone. Richard suddenly stopped pacing and threw his phone aggressively against the wall. It shattered into pieces. Eleanor jumped up, her mouth moving in what was clearly a vicious, panicked scream. They were turning on each other. The paranoia was a highly contagious poison, and it was working perfectly. "They know someone is watching," Elias murmured, his gravelly voice filled with professional satisfaction. "They think Victor Rossi's people found out about their past. They have absolutely no idea it is you." Keep the pressure on them, I told him, stepping away from the desk. I want them looking over their shoulders every single second of the day. What is our golden boy doing? Sarah handed me a fresh financial printout from the temporary desk she had set up in the corner of our rented co-working space. Marcus Jr. was completely oblivious to his parents' escalating terror. He was too busy falling into the trap we had set. According to the court-appointed receiver's logs, Marcus Jr. had just authorized another massive withdrawal from my frozen estate. He was pouring millions of my adoptive father's money into the dummy commercial real estate project we had created. He just signed the papers for the second phase of the warehouse development, Sarah said, pointing to a staggering figure on the page. He is bleeding the estate's liquidity completely dry. He actually thinks he is a real estate mogul. Let him drain it, I said smoothly. Every dollar he transfers to that project goes straight into our Shadow LLC. He is just moving my father's money from a frozen account into an active one I completely control. With my biological family occupied by their own greed and sudden terror, it was time to clean house at Vance Enterprises. I opened my laptop and pulled up the direct contact numbers for the board members who had betrayed me. Charles Montgomery, the old boys club relic who had gleefully handed my CEO chair to Marcus Jr., was at the very top of the list. I dialed his private line. He answered on the second ring, his tone brisk and annoyed. Montgomery. Good afternoon, Charles, I said, leaning back in my cheap plastic chair. I hope you are having a productive day. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Maya, you are not supposed to be contacting me. The emergency injunction explicitly bars you from communicating with active board members. I am not calling you as a former CEO, I clarified, keeping my voice perfectly calm and dangerous. I am calling you as the new majority debt holder of your private equity firm. I bought your personal debts yesterday morning, Charles. All of them. The silence that followed was incredibly satisfying. Charles was a man who lived entirely on leveraged credit, maintaining a lavish lifestyle through complex high-interest loans. He had thought aligning with Marcus Jr. would protect his fragile financial house of cards. You are bluffing, Charles finally stammered, though the arrogant drawl had completely vanished from his voice. Your accounts are frozen. You have absolutely nothing. Check your email, I instructed. I just sent over the transfer documents. I own the mortgage on your vacation home in the Hamptons. I own the credit lines keeping your wife's gallery afloat. And as of this morning, I am officially calling in those debts. Maya, please. His voice cracked, instantly shifting from condescension to pure panic. You cannot do this. It will bankrupt me by the end of the week. You abandoned my father's legacy for a man who failed at 3 consecutive tech startups, I reminded him coldly. You have exactly 2 hours to resign your seat on the board of Vance Enterprises. If you do, I will restructure your debt. If you fight me, I will liquidate everything you own by Friday. I hung up the phone before he could respond. I spent the next 3 hours repeating that exact same conversation with every board member who had conspired against me. One by one, they folded. The internal mutiny was effectively crushed from the outside, leaving Marcus Jr. acting as the CEO of an entirely empty boardroom. But the masterpiece of my counteroffensive was scheduled for late that night. Elias had arranged a highly discreet off-the-books meeting at a dark, empty diner on the edge of the city. Sarah and I sat in a vinyl booth near the back, waiting as the rain beat steadily against the windows. Right at midnight, the bell above the door chimed. Arthur Sterling, the arrogant court-appointed receiver managing my frozen estate, walked inside. He looked irritated, shaking the rain from his expensive umbrella. He had been lured here under the pretense of a private meeting with a new wealthy client. When he saw me sitting in the booth, his irritation immediately morphed into anger. This is highly inappropriate, Ms. Vance, Arthur said, refusing to sit down. I am the legal receiver of your estate. I cannot be seen meeting with you. Sit down, Arthur, I commanded. I didn't raise my voice, but the absolute authority in my tone made him freeze. I slid Elias's black flash drive across the sticky diner table. Beside it, I placed a printed photograph extracted directly from the video file. It clearly showed Arthur accepting the thick envelope of bribe money from my biological parents at the steakhouse. Arthur stared at the photograph. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The arrogant, untouchable lawyer who had kicked me out of my own home was suddenly trembling. "That is undeniable high-definition footage of you accepting a cash bribe to mismanage a $50 million estate," Sarah stated cleanly, slipping into her ruthless attorney persona. "It carries a mandatory federal prison sentence. It will also guarantee you are permanently disbarred." Arthur sank heavily into the vinyl booth across from us. He ran a shaking hand over his face. "What do you want?" "I want my life back," I said, leaning forward. "You are going to continue acting as the receiver. But starting right now, you work exclusively for me. You are going to quietly begin unfreezing my personal and corporate accounts. You are going to feed Sarah every single legal strategy my biological parents plan to use." "If I suddenly unfreeze the accounts, Richard's lawyers will immediately file an objection," Arthur protested weakly. "They will know something is wrong." "You will find legal justifications," Sarah instructed coldly. "Release funds for essential corporate maintenance. Approve delayed vendor payments. Find the loopholes you are so famous for, Arthur. Or we send this flash drive directly to the district attorney." Arthur looked at the photograph again, then slowly nodded his head in absolute defeat. He was trapped and he knew it. He agreed to every single demand we made, becoming my reluctant, terrified inside man. The final pillar of my biological parents' legal strategy had just collapsed. By the time Sarah and I returned to the co-working space the next morning, the tide of the war had completely shifted. Arthur had already quietly unfrozen a significant portion of my operating capital. The board members had all submitted their abrupt, unexplained resignations. My birth parents were paralyzed by paranoia, waiting for a black market ghost from their past to strike. Everything was perfectly aligned for the final blow. Elias walked into the office just before noon carrying a fresh stack of Financial Intercept reports. He dropped them onto my desk with a grim smile. "Your trap worked perfectly, but Marcus Jr. just hit a massive snag," Elias explained, pointing to a highlighted section of the report. "The dummy real estate project required a massive capital injection this morning, but because Arthur is now working for you, he blocked Marcus Jr.'s access to the frozen estate funds." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "So Marcus Jr. is suddenly short on cash?" "He is completely desperate," Elias confirmed. "He just received a massive margin call on his personal investments. If he doesn't cover it by tomorrow, he loses his leased penthouse, his cars, and his entire fabricated lifestyle." "He won't let that happen," I said, knowing my brother's arrogant, image-obsessed psychology perfectly. "He will find the money somewhere." "He already did," Elias said, sliding a thick, complex financial contract across the desk. "He couldn't go to a traditional bank because his credit is destroyed, so an hour ago he went to a private alternative lender." I picked up the document. It was a predatory, incredibly high-interest loan agreement. Marcus Jr. had signed over everything he possessed as collateral just to secure enough cash to cover his immediate debts and maintain his wealthy facade for a few more days. I read the name of the private lending firm listed at the top of the contract. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. Marcus Jr. had been so blinded by panic and arrogance that he hadn't bothered to have a lawyer thoroughly check the corporate registry of the lender he was borrowing from. He had just willingly signed his entire life away to cover his debts. He had absolutely no idea that the predatory lending company he had just bound himself to was a subsidiary of my shadow corporation. The muffled sound of popping champagne corks echoed through the frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom. I stood in the quiet, carpeted hallway of Vance Enterprises, listening to the very people who had destroyed my life celebrate their imaginary victory. Through the slight gap in the heavy double doors, I could hear Marcus Jr. laughing loudly, boasting to a group of local business reporters about his grand vision for liquidating the company assets. Sarah stood to my right, her leather briefcase gripped tightly in her hand. Her posture radiated absolute legal lethality, her eyes sharp and ready for the kill. To my left stood Arthur Sterling, the court-appointed receiver. He was sweating profusely, his face pale and drawn. He looked terrified of the federal prison sentence hanging over his head if he didn't follow my exact orders today. Behind us, 4 heavily built private security contractors waited in perfect, intimidating silence. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy suit. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. The faint, familiar scent of lemon polish and expensive coffee filled the hallway. This was my adoptive father's building. This was his legacy. I could feel his invincible spirit settling deep into my bones, replacing the last remaining traces of my fear with an icy, unbreakable resolve. "It is time," I whispered. The security guards pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open. The grand boardroom was packed to capacity. Camera flashes went off like blinding lightning as the local business press snapped photos. Richard, Eleanor, and Marcus Jr. were posing victoriously at the head of the long table. They were holding crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne, acting like untouchable royalty who had just conquered a kingdom. But the moment my foot crossed the threshold, the laughter died instantly. The sudden suffocating silence swept through the massive room like a freezing winter wind. The reporters lowered their cameras, sensing the abrupt, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Eleanor's champagne flute slipped a fraction of an inch in her manicured hand, the golden liquid sloshing over the rim. Richard's triumphant smile hardened into a tight, furious line. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. The fatherly, gentle tone he used for the cameras was completely gone. "You have absolutely no right to be in this building, Maya. You are legally barred from the premises." He gestured aggressively toward the building's regular security guards standing near the elevators. "Remove her immediately. She is a trespasser and she is disrupting an official corporate meeting." The regular guards didn't move a single muscle. They looked past Richard, their eyes landing squarely on me. I offered them a slow, subtle nod. They stepped back, deferring entirely to the elite private security team I had brought with me. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I walked with slow, deliberate steps down the length of the room. The sharp click of my heels cut through the dead silence, echoing like a ticking clock. The crowd of reporters naturally parted for me, their cameras quietly beginning to record the unfolding confrontation. They knew the narrative was shifting right in front of their eyes. Marcus Jr. slammed his glass onto the table, the champagne spilling over the polished wood and staining a stack of papers. "Arthur," he snapped, looking at the receiver standing nervously beside me. "Call the police right now. Tell them the evicted former CEO is violating a court-ordered emergency injunction." Arthur Sterling swallowed hard. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his suit pocket to dab his sweating forehead. He refused to look at my brother. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legally binding, freshly stamped court orders. "There is no injunction," Arthur announced. His voice trembled slightly before finding its professional footing. "As the appointed third-party receiver, I have officially reviewed the estate's complete financial history. I have found absolutely zero evidence of fraud or manipulation on Maya Vance's part. Effective as of 8 o'clock this morning, all of her corporate and personal assets are completely and irreversibly unfrozen." A collective shocked murmur ripped through the gathered press. Flashbulbs started going off in a frantic, blinding rhythm, illuminating the absolute horror spreading across my birth family's faces. Eleanor let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, grabbing Richard's arm for support. "Arthur, what are you doing? We have an arrangement. We paid you a massive retainer to—" "Be very careful about what you say next, Eleanor," Sarah interrupted. Her voice sliced through the chaotic room like a perfectly sharpened blade. She stepped forward, dropping the heavy black flash drive onto the center of the mahogany table with a loud thud. Unless you want to publicly confess to bribing a court-appointed official in front of every major news outlet in the city. Richard's face drained of all color. The arrogant, untouchable mask he had worn for weeks shattered completely, leaving behind a terrified, desperate old man. He stared at the flash drive, then looked up at Arthur, the devastating realization finally washing over him. Their inside man had been completely flipped, and their legal shield was entirely gone. I reached the head of the table. Marcus Jr. was standing right next to my father's custom leather chair. I didn't ask him to move. I just looked at him with an expression of absolute freezing authority until he nervously swallowed and took a step backward. I sat down. The leather yielded perfectly, wrapping around me like a familiar, protective embrace. The view of the Atlanta skyline stretched out behind me. I was finally back where I belonged. I unclasped the thick leather folder I was holding and slid a massive stack of documents across the mahogany wood. They fanned out perfectly, stopping directly in front of my biological parents. I looked my birth mother directly in the eyes. Her terrified, manufactured tears were already welling up, but they didn't affect me anymore. The frightened, unwanted 7-year-old girl they had left at the orphanage was officially dead. You came to my home claiming you spent decades agonizing over your missing daughter. I said, my voice projecting clearly to every single person in the room. You went on television and cried about family, about love, and about bloodlines. You tried to convince the world that I was a greedy monster who stole an old man's hard-earned fortune. I tapped the top document on the pile. It was the heavily redacted 25-year-old wire transfer receipt blown up and printed in undeniable high-definition ink. But we both know the real truth, I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal vibrating whisper that carried effortlessly over the clicking cameras. You didn't abandon me because you were struggling. You sold me to a corrupt black market adoption broker to save yourselves from crushing bankruptcy. And now the little girl you sold for cash 25 years ago is finally here to collect her debt. The boardroom exploded into absolute chaos. Reporters began shouting questions over each other, aggressively shoving their microphones forward. Eleanor buried her face in her hands, letting out a genuine panicked sob as the flashbulbs illuminated the physical proof of her monstrous greed. Richard stumbled backward, looking around frantically for an exit, but my security team had already blocked the heavy double doors. But Marcus Jr. remained completely oblivious to the true danger. He had been kept entirely in the dark about his parents' past crimes and their dangerous, dirty money. He was still operating on pure, unadulterated arrogance. "This is a pathetic, desperate distraction," Marcus Jr. yelled, trying to shout over the chaotic noise of the press. He slammed his hands down on the mahogany table, leaning toward me with a vicious, mocking sneer. "You think digging up some ancient family drama changes anything about today? It absolutely doesn't." He laughed, a harsh, desperate sound that echoed off the glass walls. He straightened his designer suit, looking around the room as if he still commanded the respect of the people inside it. "You have absolutely no power here, Maya," he declared smugly, pointing an accusing finger directly at my chest. "Even if your accounts are unfrozen, you don't control the board anymore. They all resigned. I am the acting CEO of Vance Enterprises. I hold the keys to this kingdom, and I have the vast capital to bury you in brutal litigation for the rest of your natural life." I didn't yell back. I didn't lose my temper or rise to his bait. I just sat perfectly still and offered him a slow, chilling smile that made his triumphant laughter die instantly in his throat. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single, heavily notarized contract. "You don't have any capital, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly calm and brutally clear. "You completely drained the frozen estate funds to invest in a fake waterfront development. And when you ran out of cash to cover your massive failing investments, you went looking for an alternative private lender to save you. I slid the predatory high-interest loan agreement across the smooth mahogany table until it stopped right against his trembling fingertips. You should have had a competent lawyer read the fine print of the LLC you borrowed from, I whispered, watching the absolute unadulterated horror dawn in his eyes as he recognized my signature legally binding the bottom of the page. Because you just defaulted, and I now legally own your house, your cars, and every single thing you possess. Marcus Jr. stared at the signature at the bottom of the loan agreement. The color drained from his face with terrifying speed. His hands began to shake, rattling the crisp, heavy paper against the mahogany table. The arrogant, smug CEO who had been laughing just minutes ago was completely gone. "You tricked me!" Marcus Jr. stammered, his voice cracking into a high, breathless pitch. "This is illegal! You set up a shell company to steal my assets." "I didn't steal anything," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly still. "You willingly drained my father's estate to fund a fake waterfront development. When you ran out of cash, you willingly signed your house, your cars, and your entire life away for a predatory loan. I simply bought the debt." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "You aren't a titan of industry, Marcus. You are completely bankrupt, and I legally own every single thing you possess." The local business reporters in the back of the room were furiously typing on their phones. Camera shutters clicked in rapid succession, capturing the absolute devastation on my biological brother's face. But I wasn't finished. Bankrupting Marcus Jr. was only the prologue. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a small black remote. I pointed it at the ceiling, pressing a single button. The heavy mechanical blinds covering the glass walls whirred shut, plunging the boardroom into a dramatic artificial twilight. The massive digital projector hummed to life behind me. A bright, glaring light hit the blank wall at the end of the room. I didn't look at the screen. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my biological parents. 25 years ago, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the darkened room. Richard and Eleanor Vance told the world they had to surrender their daughter to an orphanage. They claimed it was a heartbreaking sacrifice driven by severe financial hardship. A collective hush fell over the room. I pressed the clicker. The first document flashed onto the massive screen. It was the faded, yellowed wire transfer receipt Elias had uncovered, blown up to a staggering size. But they didn't just walk away from me. I continued, letting the sheer horror of the truth fill the quiet space. They handed me over to a corrupt black market adoption broker, and in exchange for permanently relinquishing their parental rights, they received an off-the-books cash settlement. I pressed the clicker again. The corrupt broker agreements appeared, displaying Richard and Eleanor's undeniable signatures right next to the massive payout figures. "They didn't abandon me." I stated the words, tasting like ash and iron in my mouth. "They literally sold their 7-year-old daughter for cash to save themselves from bankruptcy." The shock in the boardroom was absolute. Several reporters actually gasped out loud. The flashing cameras completely stopped as people stared at the screen, struggling to process the sheer monstrous depravity of the documents. I looked at Marcus Jr. He was staring at the massive projection, his mouth hanging open. He slowly turned his head to look at his parents. The realization hit him with physical force. His private schools, his designer clothes, his entire privileged upbringing had been funded by the sale of his own sister. "Mom," Marcus Jr. whispered, his voice trembling with a profound, sickening disgust. "Dad, is this real?" Richard couldn't look his son in the eye. He stared at his polished shoes, his jaw clenching defensively. But Eleanor immediately fell back into her practiced routine. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Tears spilled rapidly down her perfectly made-up cheeks. She let out a loud, theatrical sob, dropping to her knees right there on the boardroom floor. "Maya, please!" Eleanor wailed, reaching her hands out toward me. "We were desperate. We were going to lose everything. We had no other choice. We thought you would go to a wonderful, wealthy family. You left me in a sterile brick building that smelled like bleach." I fired back, my voice vibrating with decades of suppressed fury. You didn't care if I lived or died. You only cared that the check cleared. Her performance was entirely transparent now. The reporters weren't taking sympathetic photos of a grieving mother. They were documenting a cornered criminal. The false victimized facade she had used to manipulate the media was completely shattered. I turned my attention away from my sobbing birth mother and looked directly at the remaining board members sitting at the table. Charles Montgomery and his allies were pale, sweating profusely under the dim boardroom lights. You aligned yourselves with these monsters, I told the board, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. You betrayed my adoptive father's legacy to side with a family that sells their own children for profit. I pressed the clicker one last time. The ancient adoption documents vanished from the screen. They were instantly replaced by the high-definition surveillance footage Elias had captured. The video played in stark clarity. It showed Richard and Eleanor sitting in that dark steakhouse, sliding a thick envelope of cash across the table to Arthur Sterling. Arthur, who was still standing nervously beside me, let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. He took a staggering step backward, looking frantically toward the locked double doors. That is your court-appointed receiver, I announced to the press. Accepting a massive cash bribe from my biological parents to freeze my assets and dismantle my company. The cameras instantly pivoted to Arthur, flashbulbs exploding like a strobe light. He shielded his face with his briefcase, looking like a trapped rat. And where did bankrupt parents get the cash for such an expensive bribe? I asked the room rhetorically. They embezzled it. They stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from a violent black market loan shark using Marcus Jr.'s failing tech startups to launder the money. The room erupted. Reporters began shouting questions, the noise bouncing chaotically off the glass walls. Charles Montgomery attempted to stand up, his hands raised defensively. Maya, we had absolutely no idea, Charles stammered, his arrogant drawl completely gone. We were deceived. If we had known the funds were illegal, we never would have supported them. You supported them because you are weak, greedy, and disloyal, I countered coldly. I gestured to Sarah, who began pulling thick red folders from her briefcase. She tossed one forcefully to each of the treacherous board members. Those folders contain the aggressive buyout contracts for every single piece of personal and corporate debt you owe, I explained. I used my hidden assets to buy your mortgages, your credit lines, and your equity loans. I leaned over the table, looking Charles directly in the eyes. I legally own your financial survival, and as the majority debt holder, I am calling in every single cent. You are completely ruined, Charles. You are all fired effective immediately. The boardroom was a portrait of total devastation. My abusers, the traitors who abandoned me, the arrogant men who thought I was weak, they were all sitting in the ashes of their own greed. I stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of my navy suit. The suffocating weight I had carried since childhood was finally gone. I breathed in the crisp, air-conditioned air of the executive floor. The $50 million empire my adoptive father built was entirely, indisputably mine again. Then the wail of heavy sirens pierced through the thick glass windows. The flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers reflected against the Atlanta skyline. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. 6 uniformed police officers marched into the room, their expressions grim and professional. Sarah had made the call exactly when I told her to. Richard and Eleanor Vance, the lead officer announced, stepping forward with handcuffs already drawn. You are under arrest for bribery of a court official, money laundering, and severe financial fraud. Eleanor screamed a genuine, terrified shriek that echoed off the mahogany walls. She thrashed wildly as an officer grabbed her arm, clicking the cold steel securely around her wrists. Richard didn't fight. He just stared blankly ahead, completely broken, as they patted him down and read him his rights. I watched them being paraded out of the room, disgraced and ruined in front of the very press they had invited. But as the police escorted my birth parents out into the hallway, a sudden violent crash echoed from the ground floor lobby. The sound was so loud it reverberated straight up the elevator shafts. My private security team instantly drew their weapons, stepping in front of me. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Downstairs, heavily armed enforcers working for the loan shark had just smashed through the front glass doors of my corporate headquarters. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom remained securely blocked by my private security team. The sound of shattering glass from the ground floor lobby echoed all the way up the elevator shafts. It was a violent, chaotic crash that made the journalists in the room jump. The reporters instantly stopped questioning my biological parents, their heavy camera lenses suddenly pivoting toward the hallway. A low murmur of panic began to ripple through the crowded room. Sarah touched her earpiece, her eyes widening as she received a rapid update from our security detail downstairs. She stepped close to me, her voice perfectly steady despite the rising chaos. "It's Victor Rossi's men," she whispered, ensuring the press couldn't hear. "The loan shark's enforcers just breached the main entrance. They came to collect their embezzled money from Richard and Eleanor." The lead police officer in the boardroom immediately pulled his radio. He barked rapid orders to the units stationed down on the street. Through the thick glass of the executive suite, we could hear the distant piercing wail of more sirens converging on the building. The loan shark's violent enforcers had just walked directly into a massive, heavily armed police presence. I turned my attention back to my biological parents. Eleanor was completely hysterical. She was struggling wildly against the cold steel of the handcuffs, her expensive designer wrap dress twisting awkwardly around her knees. The heavy theatrical makeup she had carefully applied for the cameras was now running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The polished, victimized mother routine had entirely dissolved into pure, unadulterated terror. "You cannot do this to me!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking into a desperate wail. She looked wildly at the reporters, begging for a sympathy that no longer existed. "I am a respectable woman. I am a mother. You are making a terrible mistake. I didn't know the money was stolen." The officers ignored her theatrics entirely. They pulled her roughly to her feet, reading her Miranda rights in a bored, clinical tone. Richard didn't fight back at all. He looked completely hollowed out, a pathetic broken shell of the arrogant man who had tried to steal my empire. His face was the color of dirty ash. He stared blankly at the mahogany table, fully realizing that his life of privilege and manipulation was permanently over. "The men in the lobby just added organized crime and racketeering to your growing list of charges," the lead officer told Richard coldly. "You're looking at decades in federal prison. Let's go." They were paraded toward the heavy double doors. The local business press, sensing the ultimate climax of the story, swarmed them like hungry wolves. Flashbulbs exploded relentlessly, capturing every single second of their utter disgrace. The people who had sold me for cash 25 years ago were finally facing the brutal, undeniable consequences of their own monstrous greed. I watched them walk out of my boardroom in handcuffs, feeling a profound, incredible weight lift from my shoulders. The terrified little girl who had cried in that sterile orphanage was finally at peace. The nightmare they had inflicted on my life was officially legally over. But the room wasn't completely empty yet. Marcus Jr. was still standing near the head of the table. He was trembling violently, his perfectly tailored designer suit suddenly looking far too large for him. The realization of his absolute financial ruin had finally pierced through his lifelong arrogance. He watched his parents being led away to prison, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He was completely alone. He turned to look at me. The condescending golden boy was entirely gone. He took a hesitant, shaking step forward. The reporters had followed his parents out into the hallway, leaving just Marcus, Sarah, my security team, and me in the dim boardroom. "Maya, please!" Marcus Jr. stammered, his voice weak and pleading. "You have to help me. I didn't know about any of this. I swear to you, I didn't know they sold you to an adoption broker. I didn't know the money they gave me was embezzled from a dangerous loan shark." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, letting the silence stretch out uncomfortably. Ignorance doesn't excuse your actions, Marcus. You willingly aligned with them. You willingly sat in my father's chair, colluded with a corrupt board, and tried to dismantle everything he built just to feed your own ego. He fell to his knees right there on the expensive boardroom carpet. Tears spilled down his cheeks, dropping onto his polished leather shoes. He reached out his hands, hovering just inches from my legs, desperate for any lifeline I might throw him. "I have absolutely nothing left," he begged, sobbing openly now. "The predatory loan you bought it takes my house. It takes my cars. My personal accounts are completely empty. I don't even have enough cash to buy a meal tonight, let alone hire a lawyer. Please, Maya, you're my sister. You have hundreds of millions of dollars. Just forgive the debt." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate hope. "Give me a small stipend," he pleaded. "Just enough to survive. Let me stay in one of your guest houses. I'll do anything." I looked down at the man who had ignored my frantic screams when I was 7 years old. The man who had gladly spent the money bought with my abandonment to fund his lavish, arrogant lifestyle. I searched my heart for even a fraction of pity, but I found absolutely nothing. He was a stranger who had tried to ruin me. "You made your choices, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet room. "You chose to drain my father's estate to fund a fake waterfront development. You chose to sign your life away because you desperately wanted to pretend you were a titan of industry. You played a high-stakes game of greed, and you lost everything." "Please," he whimpered, burying his face in his hands. "I will work for you. I will start at the absolute bottom. I'll sweep the floors. Just don't leave me on the street." "You do not possess the character to work for this company," I replied smoothly, stepping away from him. "My adoptive father taught me that family is built on loyalty, respect, and unconditional support. You are just a biological accident. I am calling in your debt tomorrow morning. I suggest you find a cheap hotel tonight." I gave a sharp nod to my security team. Two heavily built private contractors stepped forward, grabbing Marcus Jr. firmly by the arms. They hauled him roughly to his feet. He cried and pleaded the entire way to the elevator, begging for a mercy he had never once shown me. The heavy metal doors slid shut with a satisfying ding, cutting off his pathetic sobs entirely. The grand boardroom was finally silent. Sarah let out a long, heavy exhale. She walked over and stood beside me, looking at the empty leather chairs where the treacherous board members had sat just an hour ago. The thick red folders containing their bought-out debts still rested ominously on the mahogany wood. "The police captain just confirmed the lobby is completely secure," Sarah reported, checking her secure tablet. "Victor Rossi's armed enforcers are in police custody. Richard and Eleanor are officially booked and on their way to holding. The local press is already running the story live on every major network. The truth is out there, Maya, all of it." "And the board members?" I asked, looking at the empty seats that had caused me so much grief. "Charles Montgomery and the rest of the mutineers have already cleared out their executive desks," Sarah said with a fierce, deeply satisfied smile. "They ran like cowards. They are terrified you will liquidate their personal assets and seize their homes today. The corporate purge is completely finished. You excised every single cancer from this company." I walked slowly over to my father's custom leather chair at the head of the long table. I ran my hand gently along the smooth, dark wood binding. The oppressive, suffocating nightmare that had consumed my life for the past month was truly over. The massive real estate empire Marcus Vance had built was safe, secure, and completely cleansed of disloyalty. "Have a cleaning crew come up and deeply sanitize this boardroom," I told Sarah, turning toward the double doors. "It smells like cheap champagne entitlement and desperation in here. I am going back to my office." I walked out of the boardroom and down the quiet, carpeted hallway of the executive floor. The regular corporate staff were peeking out of their cubicles, offering me hesitant, deeply respectful nods as I passed. They had seen the news broadcasts playing on their computer monitors. They knew the hostile takeover had failed. They knew the rightful CEO had finally returned. I pushed open the heavy glass door to my private executive suite. The room was exactly as I had left it on the devastating day Arthur Sterling had evicted me. My father's framed architectural blueprints still hung on the walls. The sprawling, breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathed in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun. I walked slowly over to the glass and looked down at the bustling city below. I thought about Marcus Vance. I thought about the incredible, unbreakable strength he had poured into me, the invisible armor he had given me to survive this exact, brutal storm. He had known the wolves would eventually come for me, and he had made absolutely sure I had the resources and the teeth to bite back. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my heart. The unwanted girl was gone. The empire was secure. My phone vibrated softly in my tailored blazer pocket. I pulled the device out and looked down at the glowing digital screen. Standing in my reclaimed office looking out over the city skyline, I receive a text from Sarah. The estate is 100% unfrozen. You're officially back. The heavy oak doors of my Atlanta estate finally opened without a single trace of resistance. The violent dripping red spray paint that had once spelled the word fraud across the pristine wood had been meticulously power washed away months ago. In its place, the massive white pillars and the polished marble entryway gleamed quietly under the warm, humid Georgia sun. I stepped inside the grand foyer, dropping my keys into the heavy crystal bowl on the entryway table. The suffocating, oppressive silence that had haunted these sprawling halls immediately following my adoptive father's death was completely gone. The house felt incredibly warm again. It smelled faintly of fresh lilies and rich coffee. It finally felt alive. Sarah was already sitting at my expansive kitchen island, sipping from a large ceramic mug and flipping casually through a massive legal binder. She looked up as I walked in, offering a relaxed, genuine smile that had been missing from her face for far too long. The final sentencing documents just came through from the district attorney's office, Sarah said, tapping the heavy leather binder with her pen. It is completely official, Maya. Richard and Eleanor Vance accepted a comprehensive plea deal late last night to avoid a prolonged, highly publicized federal trial. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, leaning back against the marble counter. What are the final terms? They are both serving 10 years in a federal minimum security facility for the bribery and organized fraud charges. Sarah explained, her voice carrying a deep professional satisfaction. The federal prosecutors are also using them as cooperating witnesses to systematically dismantle Victor Rossi's entire black market lending operation. They have absolutely nothing left to their names. Every single bank account, property, and hidden asset was entirely seized by the state to pay mandatory restitution. They are completely ruined. I took a slow, steady sip of my coffee. What about our former golden boy? What about Marcus Jr.? He vanished, Sarah replied smoothly, closing the heavy binder. After you called in his predatory loan and legally seized his leased penthouse and luxury cars, he had absolutely nowhere to run. My private investigator tracked him down earlier this week to a tiny run-down town just over the state line. The former tech genius is currently working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station, barely scraping together enough minimum wage to pay off the interest on his remaining civil debts. I looked out the large kitchen window at the massive swaying magnolia trees in my backyard. There was no triumphant joy in my biological brother's total destruction, but there was a deep, undeniable sense of absolute justice. They had all made their own calculated, greedy choices. They had gambled recklessly with my life and my father's legacy, and the house had finally won. Later that afternoon, I drove my car out to the quiet private cemetery where Marcus Vance was buried. The afternoon air was crisp and clear, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming southern jasmine. I walked slowly up the gentle manicured rolling hill, carrying a massive, vibrant bouquet of yellow sunflowers. They were his absolute favorite. He always used to tell me they were the only flowers stubborn and tough enough to thrive in the brutal, unforgiving Georgia heat. I knelt carefully beside his polished granite headstone, arranging the bright yellow flowers against the cool gray stone. I traced the deep, precisely carved letters of his name with my fingertips, feeling the solid permanence of the rock. "We did it, Dad," I whispered. The wind rustled gently through the ancient oak trees above me, offering a quiet, comforting response. "The wolves came to the door exactly like you always said they would, but they didn't take the house down." Hot tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but they weren't the heavy, suffocating tears of grief I had shed 6 months ago. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. I thought about the hidden leather journal tucked safely in my bedside table. I thought about the brilliant shadow corporation, the offshore accounts, and the heavy brass key that had unlocked my survival. He had spent the last 5 years of his life quietly building an impenetrable financial fortress around me, ensuring I would never be discarded or rendered powerless again. "You gave me the sword," I told the quiet stone, my voice steady and strong. "But you also gave me the incredible strength to know exactly when to put it down. I am safe now. Your legacy is completely secure." I sat in the soft green grass for a long time, allowing the warm sun to wash over my shoulders. I was finally releasing the last remaining jagged fragments of my childhood trauma. The terrified, unwanted 7-year-old girl, who had screamed until her throat bled in that sterile orphanage hallway, was officially at peace. She had been fiercely loved, and she had been forged into a woman made of absolute steel. By the time I returned to the corporate headquarters of Vance Enterprises, the evening sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant, fiery orange glow across the massive glass walls of the executive floor. The entire building hummed with a renewed, vibrant energy. The treacherous Old Boys Club board of directors had been entirely purged and legally barred from the industry. In their place, I had appointed a diverse, brilliant team of aggressive innovators who possessed absolute, unquestioning loyalty to my vision and my leadership. I walked confidently into the grand mahogany boardroom. It was the exact room where my birth family had tried to publicly destroy me, but it held absolutely no ghosts anymore. The air smelled of expensive polish and fresh ambition. Elias Thorne, my elite head of corporate intelligence, and Sarah were already waiting for me at the head of the long table. They had several thick, glossy presentation folders spread out meticulously across the polished wood. "The incorporation paperwork for the new charitable branch is fully finalized and federally approved," Sarah announced, sliding the top folder toward me with a proud smile. "The remaining shadow funds have been legally integrated and cleanly transferred into the new accounts. You are officially ready to launch the initiative." I opened the heavy folder, looking down at the crisp professional logo we had spent weeks designing, the Marcus Vance Foundation for Girls. I wasn't going to let the massive, untraceable fortune my adoptive father left me just sit idle in an offshore bank account collecting dust. I was going to use it to wage a completely different kind of war. The massive foundation was heavily endowed to provide immediate financial intervention, elite legal advocacy, safe housing, and full-ride university scholarships for young abandoned girls in the state foster system. "We have already successfully identified our first 50 candidates," Elias said, his gravelly voice filled with a quiet, profound respect. "Girls who have been discarded by the system, girls who have been explicitly told they have absolutely no value. We are stepping in before the trauma permanently breaks them." I ran my hand slowly over the printed list of names, reading their ages and their brief, heartbreaking histories. I knew exactly what those young girls were feeling in the dark. I knew the stinging, terrifying scent of institutional bleach and the crushing, agonizing weight of being left behind by the people who were supposed to protect you. But they were not going to face the wolves alone anymore. They were going to have the full, terrifying, unlimited power of Vance Enterprises standing directly behind them. Authorize the first round of funding immediately. I commanded, closing the heavy folder with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed through the room. I want every single girl on this list fully legally protected and financially secured by tomorrow morning. I want them to know they are completely untouchable. Sarah smiled brightly, packing her digital tablet away into her leather briefcase. Consider it done, Madam CEO. She and Elias offered respectful nods and quietly exited the boardroom, leaving me completely alone in the sprawling, glass-walled space. I walked slowly over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering, vast Atlanta skyline. The city lights were just beginning to flicker on, painting the darkening horizon in brilliant strokes of gold and electric blue. I pressed my palm flat against the cool, thick glass. I had been abandoned at 7 years old simply because I was a girl. I had been sold for cash to save the fragile, pathetic pride of cowardly people. But I had survived the orphanage. I had survived the profound grief of losing my real father. I had built my own empire from the ashes of their greed. I took a deep, full breath of the crisp, air-conditioned air, feeling a profound, unbreakable sense of peace settle permanently into my bones. The war was officially over. I was finally whole.